On poetry. Now, in this unit, we're going to be talking a little bit about how we read poems. And reading it with curiosity and confidence is super important because you're going to need a lot of patience and understanding to kind of extract the meaning of what a poem is saying. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So our objectives here are to explore why we study poetry. So why is it important? Why do we even care? What does it teach us, and how can we analyze it? So by the end of this unit, you should be able to hopefully read a poem closely, think critically about its language, and support your ideas with textual evidence. We'll also be looking at a quick introduction to criticisms, so reader response theory, new historicism, and cultural criticism. All right, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so what is poetry? So ultimately, at its core, poetry is literature that uses language intensely, such as emotion, rhythm, sound, and imagery, which all come together in this beautiful, concentrated way. And it's often really about expressing something meaningful, but with fewer words. So think of it as a much more concentrated way of saying something versus drawing it out in prose like we do in literature. So poems can be really personal, political, spiritual, or just plain strange, but in a good way. All right, so here we have different types of poems. So we have the lyrical poem, which focuses on emotions or personal experience, maybe feelings, the feelings of the writer. And they're often written with various elements of rhyme or meter. Next, we have the narrative, which tells a story. And then we have our dramatic poems, or the epics. So these are really long, drawn out poems that have dialogue or a theatrical feel. You'll see how this form, the type of form, essentially, will shape the meaning. So make sure you keep an eye out whether a poem feels like a diary, a story, or like a really drawn out play. And lastly, consider the character, plot, and the setting and the POV. So POV meaning who is talking to us, who is telling us, who is the speaker in the poem. All right. Now we have elements of poetry. So poetry really has its own tools, and you'll hear a lot about them. So we have the speaker. So who is the speaker? So oftentimes it can be the writer, but it can also be different from the writer, or it can be a younger, older version of the writer. So you really have to be in tune and listen to and read through what they're saying and whether they're using past tense or present tense. So it's really important to pay attention to details like that. Next, we have tone. So what's the mood or the vibe? Is it sarcastic, hopeful, angry? We have imagery. So what do you see, hear, or feel? So how do they use imagery in the poem? Usually it deals with a sigh, sound, taste, sense, sensations, and think about what feelings these elements are trying to evoke. Next, we have figurative language. So these include metaphor, simile, personification, etc. And we're going to talk about these a little bit more in detail later on in the unit. But ultimately, these tools really just help us understand what the poem is doing and why. All right, so how do we explicate poetry? So really, explication just means unpacking a poem line by line. So really looking at it with a microscope, essentially. So start with what you notice, look for shifts, patterns, surprises, but always ask, why did the poem write this way? There has to be a reason, and that reason is in the poem. So you're going to build your interpretation step by step and use the poem itself to back up your ideas. So here we have the steps in more detail. So you'll interpret the meaning of the poem. So think about who is the speaker. Remember earlier we talked about it could be the speaker in the present or the speaker in the past, or it could be someone else altogether. What is being dramatized and what happens in the poem. So once you answer these basic questions, you'll kind of start to decode what the poem is trying to tell you. Next, you'll analyze for clues that support your interpretation. So these are literary elements, imagery and figurative language, word choice or meaning. So word choice is super important because we have to think about why did, for example, the author use angry instead of mad. So this all has meaning. You'll identify patterns and rhymes. And lastly, you'll argue how those clues will ultimately support your analysis. And this is kind of the end process, the end of the process. This is where you organize your ideas so that that analysis builds up your argument, and you return back, you circle back and point to that textual evidence that you found in steps 1 and 2. All right. So let's go ahead and put it in action. So we'll go ahead and test out what we learned with a close read of a poem. And don't worry, you don't have to get it quote unquote right, because there is no single answer in poetry. That's the beauty, but also maybe the difficulty of it. So let's go ahead and explore what we see. Okay, so I'm going to read Theodore Roethke's My Papa's Waltz, and we're going to analyze it afterwards. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. All right, so first, let's go ahead and think about how powerful this poem is ultimately. And again, you're going to read it more than once, hopefully. And some students really see it as kind of playful or nostalgic, while others will see it as dark or even violent. So now that we've read it all together, and maybe you took some time to read it on your own, ask yourself, how do the word choices support the tone? Is this memory of love or of fear, or both? So let's go ahead and back up our opinions with evidence. So let's look at the title first. So how does the title support your interpretation? My Papa's Waltz. A waltz is usually meant to be fun and playful, right? There's dancing. So who is the poet? You have to think about whether or not the background supports your interpretation. So when was the poem written? That's really important. Context is so important when it comes to literature and poetry, because our environment will affect how we write. So is there anything significant about that time period maybe that supports or contradicts your interpretation? And also think about how the meaning is built on each stanza. So you'll point to a significant passage in the stanza that you feel will support your argument. So how does it support or contradict your interpretation? Okay, so a little bit about Theodore Roethke. So knowing a little bit about the poet can help. Roethke wrote a lot about his father and memory. He had a very complicated relationship with him, as you can see, and we kind of see that with the tension in this poem. So biography isn't necessarily everything, but it really can add a lot of context. And Roethke was an American poet. He was the son of an immigrant father from Germany. His father died from cancer when he was 14, which already kind of raises these really complex feelings. He wrote a book of poetry that focused on understanding one's identity as a child. And he also was said to have a tumultuous relationship with his father, who was often cold and rather strict. And he dropped out of college, actually, to become a writer, teacher, and poet. And he wrote The Lost Son and other poems in 1948. So as we mentioned, knowing details about the poet's life or past can change the meaning, or do you think it can change the meaning of the poem? So consider that when you are reading different poets, or even think about your favorite artist. Think about Taylor Swift. She really draws from her life when it comes to writing her poetry. Or Kendrick Lamar, he writes about his time in his environment in Compton. So think about that. That really does tend to affect the writer. All right, so let's go ahead and think about reader response theory. So this is one way to approach poetry, and that is through you. So how does it make you feel? What do you relate to it? Reader response theory is really about your unique interaction with this text, and your experience matters and it's valid. So it's a really common analysis tool, and the purpose of this type of theory is to examine, explain, and defend your own personal reaction to a text. So reader response doesn't call necessarily for outside information or historical details about the time period or a poet. So we don't really need to know anything about the context of what was happening during that time or the poet. So when you're writing a reader response, you're writing as an educated adult addressing other adults or fellow scholars. So that's pretty much your quote unquote audience. And as a beginning scholar, you want to be cautious of criticizing any text as boring, crazy, or dull. If you do criticize, you have to base your criticism on the principles and form of the text itself. Again, so you have to be able to circle back and find textual evidence that proves what you are saying. Okay. And the challenge of this type of theory is that you have to show how you connected with the text. All right. Okay. So how many different ways can we interpret meaning? Let's go ahead and check it out. So we have literary criticism, and this is just a really quick introduction to it. But we can also analyze it through other lenses aside from reader response. We have historicism, formalism, Marxism, critical race, feminist, and gender. So these are all other different types of lenses. I kind of see them as putting on like a pair of glasses when you're about to read something. So you put on the pair that allows you to read through the lens of historicism or formalism, or maybe you're curious about what it's like to read with a feminist lens or those glasses, and you put those on and you read it through that lens. So think of it in that way. Hopefully that helps. Okay, so the key takeaway, and there's many ways to interpret a poem. Hopefully you got that. Your job is really to read closely, notice what stands out, and build an argument based on evidence, which is very important. You want to always have something concrete to hold on to. Every detail, like every title or line break that you might see, could mean something. So make sure you keep your mind open and your curiosity sharp, because we really need it when we're reading poetry. And really, to circle it back, think about how when you listen to a song, how you interpret it versus how your friend may interpret it. It's going to be different from person to person, or similar. All right. Thanks so much for listening, and we will chat later. Bye.